Humbled and grateful to this group of young students when they approached the Parsi community for their project. Ours is a community that is hardly known, but Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the Indian nation, perhaps paid the best compliment when he said, and I quote, "I am proud of my country, India, for having produced a splendid Zoroastrian stock in numbers beneath contempt, but in charity and philanthropy, perhaps unequaled and certainly unsurpassed." Over the centuries, since the first Zoroastrians arrived in India, the Parsis have integrated themselves wherever they have settled, while simultaneously maintaining or preserving their own distinct customs, traditions, and thus ethnic identity. This in turn has given the Parsi community a rather peculiar standing. They are citizens in terms of national affiliation, language and history, but also maintain their ethnicity, cultural, behavioral and religious practices. Integrity, trust and humility are strong values instilled in us from a very young age and is an expectation throughout our lives.
A lot of the stories that our parents and grandparents tell us, we know the history of how they all came to India on a ship and there was a storm. We prayed, and then when they went to the Indian king, they had a bowl of milk and they put sugar in the milk. The king didn't want them in the kingdom, but basically the priest showed them this bowl of milk and put some sugar in it and said, just like this sugar doesn't make the milk overflow, we'll also dissolve in your community and sort of make it sweeter. I definitely think that we need to have these stories with us and carry them on to the next generation. But the problem with that is that it takes a lot of effort to collate all these stories and bring them together, because they'll all be in different places and there'll be a lot of contrast as well. Wikipedia will say one thing, Google will say another thing, and so I mean, if there was a place definitely where all these stories were collated and all these, it would be much easier.
So we have this particular type of textile called the gara. This the Parsi women wear the saris, but they were not the plain ordinary saris. These had all beautiful embroidery on it, Basically all from China, mainland China, because in the 1800s, the Parsis from India used to all go to China for the textiles, So when they saw these beautiful embroidery, a lot of the men started bringing back saris for their wives and to sell in India. So all the motifs are very Chinese motifs, And so that is a collection of them which some of the old Parsis still have them, really good ones.
So I found this question quite weird because I was most people don't even know about us, let alone our traditions. So anyway, some interesting things that I think, especially in elementary school, people were really fascinated by the fact that I had 2 birthdays instead of 1. So they're why do you have 2 birthdays? Why do you get to celebrate twice? Why only get 1? Food is a huge part of our culture. It's because it's so good, that's why. There's this symbol in our religion, and it's quite big. It's called the farover, and a lot of people ask about it, and they always think it's Egyptian, and they always think, and no, there are Egyptian symbols which look very similar and probably have been influenced by us.
I think there was both ways it got influenced. That's why.
But every time they see it, they think it's some Egyptian symbol, and they don't know about it that much.
I mean, you go to any Middle Eastern restaurant, you'll find the symbol on the
Yes.
back of the menu.
I was in a food truck. I saw a food truck in the US serving kebabs, and it was this holding kebabs. And I found it pretty offensive, but I mean, it was good food, so. In grade 9, in one of our courses, we learned about this term called third culture kid. And basically, it's like that for me because initially I was an Indian citizen living in Singapore, ethnically Parsi, attending an international school. So I was extremely confused at first, right? And so being in an international school, I'd have friends from like all different cultures and like nationalities. And so I wouldn't really, again, embrace the fact that I was like super Indian because I lived in Singapore most of my life. I wasn't fully Singaporean because I attended an international school and my parents came from India and were ethnically Parsi. I think most strongly I would identify myself as a Parsi. I don't know how that fits in the grand scheme of things, but I feel like just that's enough for me.
Interesting question, and I laugh because growing up in Singapore, my closest friends, so I was in a group of 4 of us, we were 4 guys, best of friends, and they always used to make fun of me because when we were out and people looked at me and said, you don't look Singaporean, you don't look Indian, or where are you from, my standard reply always used to be, and still is till today, well, I'm actually a Parsi, which is a minority race that originated from Persia if you go back far enough. But I was born in India, I grew up in Singapore, and I have lived a substantial part of my life in Ireland. So I identify myself as a Singaporean, but I always mention my ancestry as being Parsi. And from that, I then build on it. So I really, if I had to answer the question in one word, I say Singaporean.
People don't really understand is that Parsi is not the religion, it's the ethnicity. The religion is Zoroastrianism.
Yeah.
And Parsi is just a subset of that religion. So that's, again, explaining that to people as well. The whole thing, they're like, what is Parsi if it's not a religion? To explain the whole like ethnicity thing.
I think the first thing I'd probably say is I often use the term Parsi and Zoroastrian interchangeably. All Parsis would be Zoroastrians, but it's not necessarily vice versa. So in our religion, one of the beliefs or tenets of the religion is to live your life in 3 ways: by good thoughts, good words, and good deeds.
We are such a small community that nobody even knew about us. Till the book came out, we were hardly known, you see. And so there was never a conflict with any other community as such. We were just a small group. We were actually just taken as Indians. Nobody knew us as Parsis, really. Though the government recognized it, and on our IC they have a race as Parsi as a race. Then we also members of the IRO, the interreligious organization. We are one of the 10 members. So they recognize us as a group.
The Parsis here are very closely knitted. We get together, it's called Parsi Zoroastrian Association, it's called PZAS, and we have functions, regular functions for children, for adults. We have prayer ceremonies, and yeah, it's very closely.
The Parsi community has evolved over the years since our family's been here in the 70s. It's grown quite substantially. If I'm not wrong, I think there are 300 plus people, and that's just registered members. So it's quite a decent community. We have a road in Singapore, I don't know if you're familiar, called Parsi Road. So they obviously made some impact generations ago. It kind of just always reminds me of our roots and where we've come from. And I think one thing about the Parsi community is that as a whole, we're very philanthropic. So it always emphasizes how you need to give back to the community, and not just the Parsi community, to all other communities.
Was Parsi, to come to Singapore was soon after Raffles founded Singapore. Raffles founded Singapore in 1819, and this gentleman was passing through on his way from China to India in 1829, and he passed away on the ship. So when the ship docked into Singapore, the Jewish community here, in fact the Arab community here, they had heard of the Parsis. So they wrote to China to say, look, there's this Parsi gentleman who's here, who's passed away, and could you donate some money to buy a burial ground? So the Parsis of China sent some money, and they bought the burial ground, which is now Parsi Road. Right across is a hill called Parsi Hill. It used to be called Parsi Hill, and that's where they buried him. And then they wrote to the people in China to send some more money so they could buy another plot of land and build a house. So for the Parsis who were migrating or passing through Singapore, they could stay there. It was like a little bed and breakfast like thing. This Parsi who came to Singapore, unfortunately he had already passed away. After that, in the late 80s or mid 80s, there were quite a few Parsis who came. One of them was a guy called Mr. Karseji. Now, he was the founder of John Little's. You know John Little's? It was originally called Karseji Little and Company. After he was from the UK, and he decided to go back. So he sold his share of the company and to a person called John, and that's how it became John Little. Early 1900s, there was a Parsi called Mr. Pirosha Framrose who came here, and he started a soft drink company called Framrose Aerated Waters. It was in Tilakaya Street. In 1926, my father, who was in China at that time, was going back to India and passing through Singapore. My uncle asked him, would my father represent the factory in India? Because India also had a large British contingent, armed forces. So my father said, yeah, sure. And my father went there and talked to the armed forces people there and managed to get the contract to supply all the soft drinks for the British armed forces in India. So between Singapore, Malaya and India, business was fantastic. Very privileged to be in the Mistry family. My uncle, he passed away in 1953, soon after I came. He was, in the hospital quite often in those days, and he noticed that there were a lot of children sleeping in the corridors at night on mattresses. So he asked his doctor, Professor Ransom, he said, why are these children, sleeping on mattresses in the corridors? Why don't you give them proper rooms? And Professor Ransom said, I'm sorry, we don't have the money. And since you're so rich, jokingly, he said, since you're so rich, why don't you give me some money and I'll try and do something about it. The following week, my uncle gave him a check for $1 million. And in those days, $1 million was a lot of money. And Professor Ransom was very, very pleasantly surprised and shocked. Unfortunately, my uncle passed away before it, and they built a ward for the children called the Mystery Wing at the Singapore General Hospital.
With a huge thank you, first of all, for building this community from nothing. Because when they came, it was just a few Parsis in Singapore who got to know each other, I guess through chance, or maybe they knew each other from before. And so they've built this community up, and we've, over the years, we've really become like a family. We've become super like close. We know everyone. Like in Singapore, if there's a Parsi, you'll know about them, you'll know of them. You'll have met them before, seen them at some function before as well.
And they're probably related to you.
And there's a high chance, yeah, they're related to you as well.
I find a new relative every 3 months out here.
Something like that. It's like mother's brother, cousin or something like that. I don't know. They've been extremely supportive. Like every time, like someone's in trouble, someone's like facing tough times, everyone's extremely supportive. Everyone sends their wishes. Everyone helps out. So I'm really glad for that as well.
Yeah, that only is that they should come to the temple because that will ground them in later life, because life will come up with a lot of problems. So if you're grounded in your religion, it will hold you steady, because things like before I came to Singapore, I would hear people are stressed, people have depression. As a young boy, 27-year-old boy in India, I was very surprised. Stress? What is stress? Well, in India, we don't have stress. I'm talking about the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. There was no things like stress, nothing like depression. And as soon as I came over here, I realized what is stress and what is depression. So most people in a fast-paced society, maybe India also now, there is becoming fast-paced, so there would be stress and things like that. So what holds you then when you are falling down and you have no people to hold you? Religion may hold you tremendously at that moment of time. You don't need support from somebody else. You yourself can hold on, because, okay, there's somebody up there who's taking care of me.
That although we are a very small minority community, the reach we have is really exponential, and they have really good examples and role models, locally, regionally, and globally to see this. But I want them to really remember that, even though we have a good sense of belonging and a spirit within the community, it is really important to remember all races, all cultures, and really respect all cultures. We're all different, but ultimately we're all the same. We all bleed the same blood, and I think that's the most important thing. To always try to be the best you can be a good person, and as our religion states, live your life through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds.
Singapore has welcomed us here, and we should be thankful for sort of working here, being prosperous, work and be prosperous here, and we should give back to society as the older generation had done.
So hopefully they too will be well knit. And when they grow up and with their children, they'll continue the tradition of the Parsis here in Singapore. Keep up the good work.
The Parsis always believe in making considerable contributions to the history and development of the countries they settle in, and are very loyal to their countries, all the more remarkable considering our small numbers. Unfortunately, our population in India is shrinking. However, worldwide, and especially in Singapore, I'm glad to say the Parsi community has bucked that trend, and we appear to be growing from 15 years ago, thanks to the progressive Singapore government and their promotion of religious and racial harmony. Thank you.